On Lord Mayor Gordon Bradbury, if he would come up now to follow Mel in and do a welcome to City as well. So, Mel, would you like to come along, please?
Thank you, Gary. Yalunga, Yalunga. Welcome to country, welcome to land in respect of the local Aboriginal communities. I stand in front of you today to celebrate the unveiling of the Triumph Monument to mark the 80th anniversary of the DALFRAM strike of 1938 in Port Kembla. I would like to acknowledge members of Parliament, Lord Mayor Gordon Bradbury, and councillors, representatives from the Consulate of the People's Republic of China, union leaders, members and community, and Uncle Fred Moore, a special friend of the Aboriginal community whom I've known my whole life. For his work on the Illawarra Aboriginal Advancement League with my grandparents, Auntie Mary and Uncle Bob Davis. Special guests, ladies and gentlemen. We open the door to you here in Dharawal country for this special unveiling. My name's Melissa Henkelman, granddaughter of the late Auntie Mary Davis. I'm a proud member of the local Aboriginal community. Today we celebrate in Dharawal country, from the coastal areas of Sydney along the southeast coastline to the Shoalhaven River, including the Illawarra and the iconic Mount Keira. The Dharawal people are one of over 500 different clans around Australia, each offering distinctive cultures, beliefs and languages. They share a kinship across several nations with other traditional custodians of these lands, and I acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land we are celebrating on today and pay our respects to our elders past and present. On behalf of the elders and the local Aboriginal community, I thank you for your time and wish you a successful unveiling on this special occasion. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. To those who have travelled great distances, welcome. But before we go any further, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. Today we have quite a gathering as we meet in this location to acknowledge this piece of sculpture, which is reflecting a bond created between the city of Wollongong and the city of Nanjing. I'm very conscious of the empathy that was shown way back in 1938 in terms of the great tragedy that was unfolding in China, the consequences of Japanese imperialism at the time. But as one who has visited the memorial in Nanjing, we certainly have something here that reflects our connection with the suffering and hurt of others. I told him not to fire the helicopter at this time. But today is an opportunity to come aside in more peaceful times to acknowledge a dispute, an action on the part of those who worked on the docks here in Wollongong. They who contributed much, not only in their moral and ethical stance, but also in physical terms as well, in terms of their health and well-being, putting their wages and conditions on the line to reflect an empathy with those who are going through great hardship. As the Lord Mayor of the City of Wollongong, I'm proud of this history. Our industrial history is something that we want to acknowledge, here memorialise, and no doubt for many to come and reflect upon our stance for justice and a more peaceful world. Congratulations to the artist, who no doubt will be introduced later in the ceremony today. But for all those behind this initiative, I especially want to acknowledge the work of Arthur Rorris and Gary Keane. Thank you guys for your determination and effort in this regard. But at the same time, I'd also like to thank the New South Wales State Government for the funding that went into this project. To New South Wales Port for allowing us this wonderful location. It is a bit of a challenge at times coming up here, but it certainly is in the context of what we're celebrating today. and acknowledgement between the efforts of those who worked here in 1938 and recognising the pain and suffering of those caught up in the tragedy of a time which I hope we will never see again. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon, and it was very nice work getting the flyby organised as well. Thanks for that, mate. So, I would also like to thank the guests that have come along today, and I will just run through a few of those. In the audience, we have ACTU Secretary Sally McManus. Sally is always welcome in the Illawarra as well. Again, Lord Mayor Gordon Bradbury and Wollongong City Councillors. Paul Scully, MP, member for Wollongong, who's come along today. And we appreciate it, Paul, because the Parliament's actually sitting today and he's taken the effort to come here. We'd like to thank Mr. Wang Fan Fu, the Consul and Head of Political Media Divisions, and Mrs. Yai Xiaoping, the Vice Consul from the Chinese Embassy. We have apologies from Gareth Ward, the Parliamentary Secretary for the Illawarra, and the other state and federal members who are unfortunately sitting in Parliament today. We've had a lot of apologies from those. I must point out that Gareth was down here this morning as part of the deed arrangements that the sitting state minister had to come down as part of the opening. So this is our second opening. We were down here at 7 o'clock today when the sunlight was shining and everything was nice and fine. And Gareth did a great job of opening it. He was on the radio and he did a really good job of showing the bipartisanship of where we celebrate today this magnificent monument to the Wharfies and the dispute that they had in 1938. So we thank Gareth, we thank the state government for the funding for this project, and very much appreciated. We also have Paddy Crumlin, the National Secretary of the MUA, and several other officials from around the coast. We've got Will Tracy, our Deputy National Secretary, and Will was also the Chair of the DALFRAM Memorial MUA Executive Committee. We have Sue Roach, the daughter of the great WWF leader Ted Roach, who led the dispute in that day, and I'll have more to say on Ted shortly. We have Penny Lockwood, who's the daughter of Rupert Lockwood. Now, Rupert was one of the great authors of Australian working class who had a particular affinity with the DALFRAM dispute, having written several definitive works on the subject. He once described the 180 wharfies in singlets and hobnail boots who took on the combined might of government and BHP and succeeding in changing the foreign policy of the country. Rupert was a great supporter of the DALFRAM process, and he would have been very proud to see this moment today, and we thank Penny for being here to represent him. And I can't get away with doing acknowledgements anywhere in the Illawarra without acknowledging Fred Moore. Freddie's our great comrade or an Illawarra stalwart. It was nice of Mel to touch on Fred's work with the Indigenous, but Fred's work goes far beyond that. He was a stalwart of the union movement down here, great community leader, and I'll let it be known that we just recently celebrated Fred's 96th birthday, and he still comes along to every one of these. We have numerous MUA veterans and the descendants of maritime workers, some of whom were involved in the era of the dispute. I'd like to thank the reference committee members who gave their time and effort to get this monument completed, and it was no small task, I can tell you. The monument itself was actually completed yesterday morning. The plaque on that concrete went on 5:30 yesterday afternoon. Tian Lee will touch on more of that in a moment, but it was a near-run thing. Of the reference committee, I'd like to acknowledge New South Wales Ports and Trevor Brown particularly for that. We also like the Port Authority in New South Wales, Nick Whitlam, who's the chair of the Port Authority at that stage, and our outgoing General Manager and Harbour Master, Kel Dillon. And I'd like to thank Kel particularly for the outstanding work he's done over the last 10 to 11 years down here. He's been an exceptional harbour master. He was an exceptional general manager of this port. And I think I talk on behalf of all stakeholders in this port, Kel, that we're sorry to see you go, comrade. Again, Lord Mayor Gordon Bradbury, Councillor Dob Viglamini is an apology. Mark Slay from Destinations Wollongong, and our friends from Asita and the Jiangsu Society. We also welcome Mr. Tom Wang, the Director of the Generations Fund. No small amount of cash in that lot, and we thank Tom for coming down today. The artist, obviously, Tian Li Zhu, who nothing would have come of this without her work. The construction team from Pink Cactus, led by Govinda Webster, did a sensational job to get this up against the odds. It was terrific work. And a special mention to Sandra Perez. Sandra isn't here today, but it was Sandra's filming of the Pig Iron Bob film that really reignited the push around the DALFRAM dispute, and it's largely in part of Sandra's work in raising some of the funds and pushing through with great gusto that film that got us to be celebrating here the 80th anniversary of the DALFRAM. So we thank Sandra, and we recommend the Pig Iron Bob film to anybody that wants to see part of the history of this port. So we thank those all for coming. I'll come now to the actual memorial. The DALFRAM dispute kicked off in 1938, as has been mentioned here before, when the DALFRAM came sailing into number 4 jetty, which was just across the top of that hill, to load out 8,000 tonne of pig iron, supposedly going to Singapore. But when the MUA leader, or the WWF leader as it was in those days, Ted Roach, went down and spoke to the crew, he soon found out that the pig iron was actually going to Japan. And as has been mentioned by Gordon, Japan at that stage was waging a brutal war on the citizens of China, particularly Nanking, and that was being reported internationally all over the world. It was highlighted the horrors of war and everything that represented. And the wharfies that were working that ship on that particular day, once Ted had told them what was going on with it, made the decision to walk off that job and not continue loading that ship. Now, BHP in their wisdom, there was 9 other ships in the port at that stage. They just declared that no other ship would be loaded if that one wasn't being loaded, to put pressure on the guys to make them go back to work. The guys then had a meeting, the full port meeting, 180 wharfies got together and they voted unanimously not to load that pig iron. They made the statement then that they weren't going to be complicit in the attack on the citizens of China, and they weren't going to load the pig iron and scrap metal that was going to come back to those people of China as bombs and bullets. And undoubtedly at that stage people could see that it was going to come back at Australia at some stage as well. It was a very heroic decision. It was a brave decision given the political and industrial situation of the day. And the result from the Australian government was fast, and it was fairly brutal. Anybody that supported the wharfies in that fight was soon castigated. One of the Sydney radio stations that actually came out in support of them was shut down by the government. The Attorney General, sorry, not the Attorney General, the Sir Isaac Isaacs, who was the Governor General of Australia at that stage, he actually came out in support of the wharfies and highlighted the brutal reactions from the Alliance Conservative government. There had been a contract for 300,000 tonne of pig iron to go to Japan, and it was the wharfies' stated objective that would not be happening. That strike had widespread repercussions both throughout Australia and internationally. Very shortly after that, the American Longshoremen's Union refused to load scrap iron to go to Japan. London, the wharfies there, the dockers there refused to load it. In India and other areas, people realised what was going on and they said, we're not being a part of this. The major difference there, even in America, where there's no friends of the union movement, when the Japanese government complained about the lack of the trade going from the Americas, the government of the day came out and supported the wharfies, or the longshoremen's right to withhold their labour on loading that cargo. That wasn't the case in Australia. the Lyons government sent Bob Menzies, who was the Attorney General at the time, down to Wollongong to actually stand over the wharfies and impose what was called the Transportation Act in those days, commonly known as the Dog Collar Act, with threats of jailing people. They issued licences trying to get any other people to come down to load or any other workers to come down and load that ship. The community support that had come out of this dispute, I think, stunned everybody, particularly stunned the government. They couldn't believe it. The community rallied around those wharfies, and when those licences were issued, there was only one licence ever taken up. It was taken up by one man that took it down to the front of the town hall in Wollongong, and it was ceremoniously burnt in that spot. Nobody else took up a licence to work on that vessel. That says a lot about the Illawarra and the people that were here. The unions, both locally, nationally and internationally, also rallied around the stance that was taken. The community organised, there was a women's committee that got together and organised food drops for the striking wharfies. In very short order, they shut down the steelworks and put another 4,000 steel workers out of work in the 11 weeks across Christmas. In what was already an impoverished period, those guys across a Christmas period, the intention of that was to put more pressure on the wharfies and drag them back to work. The absolute opposite occurred. The community rallied around the position. Nobody saw the sense in sending that cargo to Japan, and the support that came in this area was highlighted on the day that Menzies came into town to put the bounce on the wharfies to send them back to work. He had two meetings in Wollongong, and the first was in the Wollongong Hotel, and the second was across the road at a different venue. There was that many people turned out in the street to protest against Menzies and he's coming down here that the police actually approached Ted Roach and the wharfies to escort Bob Menzies across the road, and it was the only way they could guarantee his safety. We've got a photo up in the union rooms of the guys walking across the road around Menzies, and the guy at the front, there's one old bloke in the front with a hat on, and he saw the humour of it. He was chuckling his head off while he's walking across the road with Bob Menzies carrying down behind him. It was a wonderful shot. So that was the day that one of the Women's Committee actually put on Bob Menzies the name of Pig Iron Bob. And that was to prove to be a moniker that stuck with him for the rest of his political career and right up to his death. And I think it was, as much as anything else, that highlighted the effect and the effectiveness of that DALFRAM dispute. So, long story short was that 11 weeks later, the government met with Jim Hooley, who was the National Secretary of the Waterside Workers Federation, and advised Jim that there would be no more steel contracts going out of the country. They asked that the DALFRAM be finished loading. The wharfies, under protest, finished loading that ship, but that was the end of any 300,000 tonne contract that was going to pig iron to go to Japan. It was an outstanding victory. It was a victory of a dispute run on moral grounds. There was nothing in the wharfies as far as improved conditions or payments or anything else. It was purely on a social and moral dispute that was in support of the Chinese population that were being massacred at the time, and a protest against the war that we knew was coming. So those guys left an incredible legacy to be followed in this country, and an incredible legacy for unions to realise. Now there's a lot of points of this that in a time when racism is starting to raise its head again, these guys didn't care if it was in China, they didn't care if it was in India, they didn't care if it had been in South America. They were supporting workers in other countries and trying to stop, and weren't going to be a part of complying with a foreign policy that was feeding the Japanese war machine at that time. So that's the background of it. We will move on to bring up some of our speakers today and get through this hopefully before we get rained on. First speaker today, I'd like to call up Paddy Crumlin, National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia and the President of the International Transport Workers Federation.
He looks like the National Secretary and I look like the poor Kembler. Bad day to ride the motorbike down, I'll give you the note. Firstly, I want to recognise the Dalwell people, elders past and present. And when you think this beautiful spot, take away the steelworks, take away the prefab sheds, and look around you and you see this beautiful land that they had preserved. I think they held up to close to 60,000 people when our Indigenous people crossed the land bridge into Darwin, into the Northern Territory. It took them a while to walk down here. They must have gone a long way, I think. But they've been here for about 20,000 years, I think, in this area. And when you see the beauty of the place and you think about that we are talking about iron ore that comes out of the land, the rich bounty of the land that was theirs, that when we recognise elders, we recognise the history, recognise the wealth of experience and objectivity, but also recognise how the land was preserved so that we have a special sense of our own identity here in Australia, and I want to thank them for that first and foremost. So Lord Mayor and Uncle Fred, he's got his glasses on. I want to recognise Jimmy Donovan, who's over there. He's the president of the Maritime Union of Australia and a long-term activist in the Waterside Workers Federation. There's many here, rank and file, seafarers and wharfies, construction, forestry, maritime, mining and energy. That's a mouthful, isn't it? I call it the CF Mumblers Union, CF But and also activist Arthur. Good to see you, champion. Nick Whitlam, great father. You're a fantastic bloke, and to see Nick continuing to make a contribution to the modern Australia and contemporary Australia says volumes about the Whitlams themselves and the real Australians, now the spirit of Australia in many ways, that we're able to recognise where we come from and more importantly where we should be going. So it's a bit of synchronicity for me here, because I was a seafarer out of Port Kembla, and quite often I used to come out the breakwater, and we went down to Western Port, and they say, go out the breakwater, turn right. That was the instruction from the old A&L skipper that I was on. So, and then he'd retire to his somewhere to have a couple of scotches. But they were not giving him up. They were tough days, and that was when we had an Australian national line owned by the Australian people, because we believed that the only way we could properly secure our national interest and national security was by being able to control the trade in and out and around our coast. It wasn't an accident. And part of it was learned out of things like the DALFRAM, that if you leave it up to institutions, political and corporate institutions, they don't have necessarily the interests of the country in their favour. And when you think about work, the Dog Collar Act, and I'm not going to go through it, but we've got a type of a Dog Collar Act on the Australian workforce again, because sometimes we exercise our right to make decisions and to put decisions into action. And certain institutions don't like it, and again, political and corporate institutions. So there's a whole synchronicity for me. And not only that, in the Second World War, when you think about Ted, who predicted, when you read what Ted had to say, he predicted that this stuff was going to be revisited on working men and women in this country and countries all over the world in the manner of making what he predicted it. And he convinced those 180 tough wharfies in those days with the Dog Collar Act, you were lucky to have your licence and H has gone through it. You get it burned up and you didn't have a right to work. That was the reality of making that decision at that particular time. And when you read what Ted had to say, they were very careful. They weren't adventurous. He said, let's go aboard the ship. This is what we turn to. Go down, talk to the native crew, find out where it's going. And then when he found out it was going to Kobe, Japan, they went and said, what do you want to do? They said, we're off. 180 of them, knowing that they probably wouldn't be worked again, or that was the one of the very precarious things that go along with the action that they took. And in fact, they were out for 10 weeks with tremendous pressure upon them. So these are great things when we talk about the Anzac spirit, or we talk about the spirit of Australia, and everybody's got a claim to it. When you take decisions like that based on a moral judgment, based on a political judgment, by doing a risk assessment about what might happen to you, but at the end of the day, it equates to action in the interest not only of yourself, but in the interest of humanity generally. And to see that borne out by 1 in 8 Australian seafarers. This is why this is such a special place for maritime workers. 1 in 8 Australian seafarers died off the coast, many of them within sight of this headland here, on ships called the Iron Chieftain, owned by BHP, a homegrown Australian company. And I'm not sure if BHP's in the room. They're probably not in the room, because they're still having a bit of a vendetta against maritime workers in places like Port Hedland, where they're taking away their right to bargain and their right to be able to have freedom of association with their own union. And so this whole thing is about turning around a country that continues to repeat the mistakes of the past. And what we're doing here is celebrating the character, the fibre, the willingness, the spirit that is as much a part of the Australian people, the Australian culture, as any other single factor, Anzac or otherwise. We're proud to be here. We're proud to be able to translate our labour into something good and to build something like BHP. Part of the history was we were prepared to stand in the face of, it's not against the Japanese. The rape of Nanking was going on. It was a dreadful thing, and no one had the courage to confront the fascism and the imperialism that sat behind it. And again, it was a place to do business. It was a place to do business, and there's the equivalent that in the economies of the world today, whether it's the Middle East or anywhere else, where you're able to separate values, be able to separate political values, be able to separate moral values, and go and do it because it's good for business. And if people stand in the way, they are removed, just as Ted was in the 180 words. See, we're celebrating great courage, and out of that great courage came lessons that continue to resonate today in the broad spectrum of everybody that's here and everybody that's going to read and be aware of what happened here 80 years ago. And I see Monica there, people that have dedicated their life to the labour movement because they know the labour movement encapsulates the very best of what it means to be an Australian, the very best of what it means to be a true Democrat, the very best that it means in terms of courage, determination, and the very best in terms of how you're able to generate enough energy around you to provide a future for someone else. The DALFRAM provided a future for us because they stood in the face of imperialism, economic elitism, powerful legislative change. And Sally got in trouble a little while ago. She didn't get into trouble, she was proud to say it. What do you do with bad laws? You stand up to them. What are we celebrating here today? We're celebrating that 180 waterside workers, backed by workers all over the country. And it wasn't just here, it was in German ships in Melbourne. It was done systematically, and H has outlined that. What we're doing here is celebrating that courage in its transformative effect. And the laws, the Dog Collar Act, everything that was put in place and has been replicated again in this country sought to stop that courage and that determination. Well, because of the DALFRAM, because this is now, and I can hardly wait to hear from the artists, it's such a powerful and evocative statement in itself. Because of that and what it means, we have got a future in this country, and I couldn't be prouder than be standing alongside you in this august company of working men and women, true believers that we only, we not only can make a difference in this country today and in this world today. Union is, peace is union business, and we're determined to continue to make a difference. We are the difference. Thank you very much.